Hello, welcome to this South Carolina Association of Realtors Fair Housing event. I'm happy to be here. Today we're going to spend a few minutes on the ever-important topic of furry fair housing in an abridged version of our You Bet Your Assets education session. I'm Victoria Cowart, and I'm pleased to be here as Director of Education and Outreach for Pet Screening. I've enjoyed a career in multifamily property management, managing apartment communities, both conventional and subsidized, HOAs, and a portfolio of mobile home communities as well. Throughout my career, I've been an ardent supporter of the industry associations, including, of course, the Association of Realtors. I'm also delighted to share that I taught pre-licensing courses for property management here in the Charleston area for the Charleston Trident Association of Realtors. Education and legislation have always been among my industry passions, and that's what's brought me to where I am today. So let's jump in. Civil rights activists and supporters achieved the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, signed by President Lyndon Johnson. Then that act was updated with the 1968 Civil Rights Act. The 1968 Civil Rights Act was an expansion of the 1964 landmark prohibitions against various forms of discrimination. The 1968 Civil Rights Act included Title VIII, which is known as the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Amendments Act came along in 1988. Now, taken in combination, the Fair Housing Act includes 7 federally protected classes. Please check with your municipalities to see if there are additionally protected classes. The Fair Housing Act protects people from discrimination when they are renting or buying a home, getting a mortgage, seeking housing assistance, or engaging in other housing-related activities. It covers most housing. In very limited circumstances, the Act exempts owner-occupied buildings with no more than 4 units, single-family houses sold or rented by the owner without the use of an agent, and housing operated by religious organizations and private clubs that limit occupancy to members. In context for the focus of this session, what? The Fair Housing Act, FHA, makes it unlawful for a housing provider to refuse to make a reasonable accommodation that a person, there's the who, with a disability, and there's the why, needs to have equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling. Considered a helpmate to bridge the gap in the abilities of a disabled person versus a non-disabled person. HUD released FHEO 2020-01 notice, the Assistance Animals Notice, clarifying the rights and obligations under FHA regarding assistance animals, and this notice supersedes prior HUD guidance from 2013, making it the first notice of guidance in 7 years. This guidance is intended to help us distinguish between a person with a non-obvious disability with a legitimate need versus a person without a disability who simply wants to have a pet while avoiding pet policies and related pet cost. Why was this released? Complaints are on the rise because complaints of this nature are the most common type of fair housing complaint that FHEO receives, with that number at or near 60% of their complaints. Now let's discuss assistance animal accommodations in more depth. Let's start first with the definition of a disabled person. A disabled person is one that has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, has a record of being disabled or is regarded as being disabled, and is making a request for a reasonable accommodation. But what is a reasonable accommodation? Great question. A reasonable accommodation is a change, exception, or adjustment to a rule, policy, or practice or service, and it includes the public and common use spaces in our communities. It goes to the root of what we do, ensuring customers can use and enjoy their homes. Specific to that today, we'll be reviewing information about reasonable accommodation requests for assistance animals. You'll hear the word reasonable a lot in our discussion, so let's hit what's unreasonable. An unreasonable request is one that creates an undue financial burden, fundamentally alters operations, or one that creates a direct threat. I like to educate in terms of 2s and 3s for retention purposes, so let's pause for an overview of the legislation and organizations involved in our discussion. There are 2 types of assistance animals, service animals and support animals. There are, on the norm, 2 types of legislation, ADA and FHA. Some among us may also find they're subject to the Rehabilitation Act, often referred to as Section 504. That's for subsidized communities. And there are generally 2 regulatory partners who are on the compliance end of this discussion, and that is DOJ and HUD. Let's turn now to the HUD part of the discussion. So while we spoke to the FHEO 2020-01 notice early, let's dive a bit further into it now for the next 3 slides. This notice has 2 parts. The first part is a guide for housing providers in assessing requests. The second part is a guide for the requesters. The first part covers what is needed for us to assess a request that we receive. The second part is intended to be given to medical or healthcare providers to show what information should be in a letter of support of the request. Assistance animals in housing are one of two things. Again, service animals, and this is any dog that is individually trained to do work or perform a task for the benefit of an individual with a disability. Those disabilities may be physical, sensory, psychiatric, intellectual, or other mental disabilities. Work or task, in this case, must be directly related to the disability. Support animals are trained or untrained animals that do work, perform tasks, provide assistance, and/or provide therapeutic emotional support. Emotional support animals are expressly precluded from qualifying as service animals. This notice provided clarity on the types of household animals and distinguishes them from unique animals, defining the common household animals as dogs, cats, small birds, rabbits, hamsters, gerbils, other rodent, fish, turtle, or other small domesticated animals traditionally kept in the home for pleasure. The notice created a classification of animals called unique animals. Those include reptiles, barnyard animals, monkeys. These are non-domesticated animals. They are not household pets, and there is now a substantial burden to demonstrate the need in the information that you'll receive from the healthcare provider. It must confirm that allergies prevent the use of a domesticated animal, that without the animal, the symptoms or effects of the disability will significantly increase, and if it's a barnyard animal, the requester must be seeking to keep the animal outdoors within a fenced-in yard. HUD in this notice says that Internet documents, including certificates, registrations, and licensing documents for assistance animals, are not, by themselves, sufficient to establish that an individual has a non-observable disability or disability-related need for an assistance animal. We'll talk more about this in a minute. With reasonable accommodation requests, there are two components to consider: whether there is a disability and what the connection is, the nexus between the disability and the request. Now that we're clear on the two components, disabled or not, existence of a nexus or not, we can discuss the two pathways, service or support animal. The first pathway is for a service animal, and on this pathway we can only ask two questions, and we cannot require documentation. Those questions are, is the animal required because of a disability, and what work or task has the animal been trained to perform? The second pathway is for support animals, and on this pathway, we have a wider path within which to work. On this pathway, we are able to require documentation and have a right to documentation that is, according to HUD, reliable. And in that documentation, we are looking to confirm the answers to these questions again, related to disability and to the purpose of the animal. Here, proof is required, but training is not. Let's dig into this wider pathway a bit further now. In essence, we are seeking to confirm disability and disability-related need for the accommodation being requested. Now let's talk about how we get there. On the disability topic, is a disability observable or known? By known, ask yourself if the requester receives disability benefits like SSI or other disability benefits, such as those from the Veterans Administration. If the disability is neither observable or known, HUD says you can require documentation and explains that one reliable form of documentation is a note from a person's healthcare professional that confirms a person's disability affecting a major life activity. Part two of the component is the connection of the request to the disability. The nexus is the terminology you'll hear on this. HUD says on this, the note from the person's healthcare professional would also cover the related need for an assistance animal for therapeutic purposes when the healthcare professional has personal knowledge of the individual. And it is important and worthy to note, the courts have said, the accommodation must be necessary to facilitate a disabled individual's ability to function. And the concept of necessity requires at a minimum the showing that the desired accommodation will affirmatively enhance a disabled person's quality of life by ameliorating the effects of the disability. With reasonable accommodation requests, there are two components to consider: whether there's a disability and what the connection is. Again, the nexus between the disability and the request. We've covered that. Now let's focus on the next phase of the process, which is the potential outcomes. So where does all of this leave us? Let's hit a few key points before we move on. First, we have a duty to consider all requests, not to approve them all necessarily. It's advisable to reference an interactive process, which HUD says is a good faith dialogue with the individual making the request. Can we require a particular form or format of request and documentation? The answer is no. We're entitled to reliable documentation from a healthcare professional with personal knowledge, and that is what we can require. And we are able to request details? No. You cannot ask details about the disability itself. That's a big no. Okay, so we have the paperwork. What now? HUD says a best practice is to turn around a response to the requester within a 10-day timeline. Otherwise, HUD says the requester can consider their request denied. Working within that 10-day period, though, let's see what's next. In your company, do you forward the request to corporate, or are you the last stop for such requests? If you're the last stop, evaluate the documentation and its reliability. Evaluate the reasonableness of the request. Then consider whether to approve, reject, or to continue the interactive process. You would consider denying the request if the customer is not documented or known to be disabled. This is the first checkbox if you have a valid request. You would consider denying the request if the request is not reasonable, and certainly if it is not related to their disability. You would consider denying the request if the request represented a direct threat for certain, like a dog you learn has a bite history or see demonstrating aggressive behaviors. And if you're at the point of denying a request because it is not reasonable or related or poses a hazard, you could deny it, or you could deny that particular request while also stating that you'd like to consider continuing the interactive process, asking whether there's another accommodation that could ameliorate one or more of the symptoms associated with the disability, assuming, of course, that you've checked that disability box first. If you are able to approve the request, do not treat the animal as a pet at any point in the future. Do not charge pet-related fees. Do not include the animal in your pet limits. Like having only 2 pets per home are allowed, and this now counts as one, and they may only have one other. This is not a pet, and it does not count towards your pet limits. Make sure, if you have the requester sign paperwork, that it is for an assistance animal and not a pet. Request the health records of the animal, pop them into your files, and do your best to track those vaccinations in the future. So with that, I'll say thank you for joining me for this brief session. And I'll say keep an eye on your upcoming events for the Association of Realtors. I anticipate a live and more complete presentation of these materials to include a Q&A, could be coming later in April, and I look forward to a great audience.